Okay, well, first up, we have Dr. Erik. Hello, Dr. Erik.
Yes, hello. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. So, Dr. Erik is a private wildlife and livestock veterinarian that has been based in Botswana since 2003. He is senior director of a multi-species for vet practice in the capital, and I'm sorry if I say this wrong, Gaborone?
Yeah,
Gaborone?
that sounds good.
He graduated from the Faculty of Veterinary Service, University of Pretoria in 1990 and completed an MPhil in wildlife management from the same university in 2012. He's an honorary research fellow at Botswana University for Agricultural and Natural Resources, the chairman of the wildlife group of the South African Veterinary Association, and currently enrolled in a graduate certificate course in wildlife conservation and forensic science at the University of Florida. His work frequently takes him to the wilderness areas of one of the most amazing countries in Africa, working with the most amazing wildlife and with colleagues on various programs involving human-wildlife conflict, rhino management and conservation, and translocation of species such as rhino and elephant. Dr. Erik is also the founder and CEO of a newly established nonprofit conservation trust named Wild Assist Africa Trust, which aims to assist existing endangered and threatened species conservation projects with veterinary wildlife management, training, research, forensic, and logistical support in the sub-Saharan Africa. So give it up for Dr. Erik, please. And
Great.
I think your presentation is in speaker mode. If
Okay, good. So you can hear me and you can see it.
is there a presenter mode?
Let me just see. Yes, in my side, it looks like presenter mode.
We can see like your current slide and your next one with your notes.
Oh, I see. All right. So yeah, it's because I'm doing screen sharing. So let me just go to, oh, I see. Yes, I see what you mean. Let me see. How can I get out of presenter mode? Uh,
Display settings,
yes. All right. And then?
swap screen.
Aha.
Yes.
Is that it?
Yes, perfect. Thank you so much.
Ah, good. All right, great. Thank you very, very much for the opportunity to present to you today. I uh, I think you may have noted by listening to the introduction that I'm probably one of the few people now that has managed to qualify for both pensioner discount and student discount at the same time. But anyway, I am here to talk to you about challenges with balancing animal welfare and conservation from an African perspective. And I hope that you will be able to get used to my very heavy Southern African accent, but I will try my best to speak slow enough so that you can understand or that you can hear what I'm trying to say. Uh, so let me go straight away. The science of animal welfare evolved over centuries from the days of the Roman Empire, where animals were considered instruments with no moral standing and just to be used, to the modern day acceptance that animals are sentient, who are aware, can feel, and can suffer, and whose welfare and happiness needs to be upheld. The post-Second World War welfare concerns spilled over from intensive production systems and the use of farm animals to concerns relating to the use of animals in laboratory tests, wildlife in circuses and zoo displays, and recently also to the welfare of wild animals under less confined human control, such as game ranches, game reserves, and conservation areas. Welfare concerns based on stress levels shifted to sentientism and utilitarianism, with happiness as the criterion, and additionally diverged into more extreme ideals such as animal rights and the abolitionism movement, and it also resulted in the concept of compassionate conservation. Merging conservation challenges with acceptable wildlife welfare norms are becoming increasingly difficult within the contesting frameworks of resource competition and human rights versus modern animal welfare expectations and animal rights. And key to the modern ethical debate on animal and wildlife welfare and rights in Africa are the issues of commercializing wildlife as an integral part of sustainable use, wildlife research, and even the need to control wildlife numbers in closed and even some open wildlife management systems. The debate is complicated by the shift from evidence and science-based consequential welfare ethics to universal deontological ethics based on assumptions, sometimes lacking clear evidence of support or requires indirect assessment methods developed for domestic animals in controlled conditions. Wildlife veterinarians in the African framework are important decision makers in wildlife conservation management practices and key custodians of wildlife welfare. We are often caught in the ethical crossfire of rights of people versus rights of animals, happiness of animals versus the happiness of people, and the rights of the individual organism versus the needs of the ecosystem, thereby constantly required to balance decisions between apparent conflicts. So my presentation today aims to provide an African perspective on the challenges faced by the wildlife veterinarians and wildlife managers to merge biodiversity conservation and the different animal welfare perspectives, and of course to stimulate thought. And for this purpose, I will be using two real-life situations relating to elephants with many photos of elephants, and I mean many photos of elephants. I also need to put my disclaimer at this stage, where I have to state that my perspective is not considered as the only perspective. I acknowledge the many gaps in my assessment, which is based on a combination of facts, observations, and assumptions, and it is limited by the subjectivity related to wildlife welfare assessments and my lack of experience on similar issues at other continents. So allow me a moment to recap what we consider animal welfare. Use define welfare as a state of complete animal welfare as a state of complete mental and physical health, where the animal is in harmony with its environment. Stress was considered an important indicator for welfare, and as such, many studies focus on measuring physiological stress. Dawkins then radically changed the concept in 1980 by arguing that the sentience of animals is the fundamental consideration in animal welfare, where the mental state is considered positive in the absence of suffering or the presence of pleasure. And suffering is considered as strong negative emotional states such as pain, fear, frustration, deprivation, and boredom. And recently, the term well-being has been brought in use. So Garcia defined the difference as follows. Welfare relates to the physical state of health, comfort, and ability to behave naturally and cope with its living conditions. It focuses on measurable outcomes, such as disease, injury, and behavioral patterns that indicate stress or discomfort and ensure that basic needs are met, and suffering is reduced to a minimum. It reflects the immediate health status and living conditions, and it is widely used from a legal and scientific perspective to relate the physical and psychological state of animals to the conditions they are kept in. And it emphasizes the human ethical obligations to ensure that the needs and welfare standards are met. Animal well-being, on the other hand, is a wider concept that includes the physical state, mental, and emotional states of animals. It represents the overall quality of life of an animal to include physical health, psychological state, and the fulfillment of its natural behaviors and mental needs. So this refers not only to freedom of negative experience, such as pain and fear, but also the presence of positive experiences such as comfort, pleasure, and stimulations to its environment. The definition of animal welfare that concerns the physical and mental well-being of animals, mainly those under direct human care, has given rise to the 5 principles of animal welfare, of which I assume that you are pretty well familiar with, and I am not going to spend much time on it. But what about wildlife, free-living wildlife in this case? 2 wildlife welfare-orientated concepts emerged recently to address the welfare of free-ranging wildlife. The one is compassionate conservation, which is a more extreme outflow from utilitarianism and sentientism. It emphasizes the moral value of sentient animals, challenges traditional methods that harm, and advocates for integrating compassion into conservation practices. The ethical foundations of compassionate conservation are built on 4 key principles: do not harm, individuals matter, peaceful coexistence, and inclusivity. The concept of compassionate conservation, has become very popular within the Western urbanized public, partially because it's appealing from a compassionate perspective. However, several traditional conservationists have criticized the concept of compassionate conservation. They raise concerns that it will undermine the basic principles of biodiversity conservation, where populations, species, and ecosystem conservation should take preference, often sacrificing individuals. Many other concerns were raised, which we will mention again a little bit later. There is a general acceptance, though, amongst traditional conservationists that animal welfare is important, but that it should not overshadow the primary goal of conserving entire populations and ecosystems. Free roaming wildlife welfare requires a more balanced and a practical approach, which integrates ethical concerns for individuals with effective evidence-based conservation practices to ensure the best outcomes for biodiversity. And that gave rise to the concept of conservation welfare. Conservation welfare is grounded in the animal welfare ethics. It combines consequentialism and utilitarianism. It aims to minimize harm while achieving the greatest good for the greatest number. But it accepts that some harm is needed if it leads to overall benefits. Harm is minimized through evidence-based methods, and where needed, need to be humane in execution. Conservation welfare typically focuses on sentient animals. It uses systematic approaches to weigh the potential harm and benefits of different actions in achieving the greatest overall good. So it provides clearer guidelines for decision-making in complex scenarios. And this approach is more pragmatic and evidence-based, and it's making it potentially more acceptable to traditional conservationists. But how do we do welfare assessments of management-related veterinary interventions involving free-ranging wildlife? How does it fit into this? Now, if we consider both Garcia's definitions of welfare and well-being and the objectives of conservation welfare, then wildlife welfare will be the most important consideration. It assesses the physical state of health and the psychological state of comfort to its surrounding conditions. And it uses signs and measures of disease, injury, and behavioral patterns of distress or discomfort as the assessment parameters. Well-being assessments will involve the longer-term physical, mental, and emotional states of the animal post-procedure, and for that matter, even post-procedure, pre-procedure, and how it will affect its relationship with the same or the new environment. But the requirements to consider emotional state and welfare consideration of free-ranging wildlife during or after these procedures are very, very complicated. First, it's difficult to measure directly. Secondly, determining the impact of the emotional state of distress on the overall well-being of the animal is challenging and largely subjective. And thirdly, it is impossible to distinguish between emotional influence caused by natural interactions and disturbances related to the procedure or intervention. So let us illustrate the challenges using two wildlife management related situations with African elephants in Southern Africa. And I'm choosing elephants specifically because they are considered sentient and charismatic and attract a lot of empathy related responses from the public. There's no doubt that elephants are one of the most charismatic mammals on the African continent. They are intelligent social animals with strong bonds between individuals. They have remarkable subsonic communication skills, and the gentle giant image makes it very, very easy for people to relate to them. The joy and pleasure portrayed while bathing or mud bathing is very, very soothing, and I can watch them for hours. There's an estimated 415,000 savanna elephants left in Africa. So that figure that is portrayed there is actually both the forest and the African savanna or bush elephant, different names that they've given to it. But Botswana, where I reside, hosts the largest population of between 130 and 145,000 elephants. And that is more than 30% of Africa's elephants. Most elephants in Africa outside South Africa, apart from a few small populations of less than 50 individuals, are free roaming. So protected areas here are not fenced in. And veterinary control fences and boundary fences are mostly permeable enough for elephants to cross. In contrast, in South Africa, as you can see on the slide, it has the third largest population in Southern Africa, with about 32,000 elephants only in Kruger National, the Greater Kruger National Park. But it has a significant number of small populations in fortified electrified fenced parks. and private reserves that restrict and confine movement. Although the elephants are still able to move around and exhibit normal behavior, small fence populations require intensive management inputs and population control. And when I refer to small fence, it's relative. And as you will see uh, from our examples, then we are talking about a few thousand acres. The smaller the size of the reserve, the higher the required management inputs. The implication of the large free-roaming population in African countries relate mainly to competition for resources and human-wildlife conflict. Something which is not within the scope of this presentation. So hopefully that is another story for next year. So as background to my little welfare assessment experiment that will follow, I want to share with you a recent tragedy that unfolded in South Africa. The photo credit for the Madikwe situation goes to True Green Alliance, and my apologies in advance for the graphic photos. Madikwe Game Reserve is a 75,000 hectares, as you can see, 185,000 reserves, so it's quite big, acres, in the northwest province of South Africa. It has been established in 1991 as a partnership between the provincial government, local community, and private sector, but it's managed on behalf by the local government, the Northwest Parks and Tourism Board. Apart from the significant elephant population, it also hosts a large population of the critically endangered South Central black rhino and the endangered southern white rhino, lion, leopard, cheetah, wild dog, spotted hyena, Cape buffalo, even hippo. Several other species constitute the rich biodiversity found in the park. Income is from tourism, and several high-end luxury tourism lodges were built in the park, offering an African safari experience. In 1992-93, shortly after they established the park, 219 elephants were introduced into Madikwe, followed by the introduction of 8 elephant bulls in 1998. In the 2022 Elephant Management Plan for Madikwe, it is noted that the reserve's ideal capacity is a total of 500 elephants, with the uppermost limit of 1,000 elephants. The elephant population increased by 6 to 7% per year and was estimated to be more than 1,700 in 2024. The Elephant Management Plan mentioned that the population has exceeded the projected carrying capacity, but they stated that no mortalities were seen or expected as a result of drought-related food stress to the near future. So the Elephant Management Plan attributed to the potential of an intrinsic population growth control created by intra-Pacific competition around the waterholes. In other words, if you restrict their foods, they're going to stop breeding, and in the end, they're going to reach a threshold. The Elephant Management Plan described elephants as complex sentient beings with complicated social structures and herd dynamics, and cautioning the need for the implementation of precautionary methods in certain situations, because translocation opportunities in South Africa for elephants are pretty limited. So it considers the use of population control measures, including translocations, hunting of single bulls, immunohormonal surgical contraceptives, but it considered culling as a last resort due, and I quote, the emotional sentiment afforded to the species and reputational risk associated with this, unquote. Numerous warnings to start population control despite and reduce the elephant population from over 5 years were ignored. Then followed one of the worst droughts in 40 years in southern Africa, and the situation deteriorated last year. So by October, November, an estimated elephants, or more than 80 elephants, starved to death. Although the number of calves that died and were consumed by scavengers are unknown. Other elephants had to be put down because they were in a severe catabolic state and too weak to walk. Mortalities amongst other species occurred, with many other animals in very, very poor body conditions. It emerged that the welfare consideration, it emerged that the welfare considerations under the influence of the no harm principle and the fear of public backlash that could affect tourism were important considerations in allowing elephant numbers to exceed the acceptable thresholds. The severe implications on the welfare of animals and other species and the negative impact on the biodiversity did not require special assessments to appreciate. Visual assessment of body condition and compromised demeanor was enough to confirm that animals were physically and mentally compromised and were suffering. And this was coming over time. So, Under pressure from traditional conservationists and animal welfare groups, and even legal threats, the Northwest Parks Tourism Board committed to starting a limited culling program. But rain arrived shortly after in December last year, bringing with it temporary relief. But the inevitable is going to repeat itself during the dry season, with repeated severe negative consequences on both biodiversity and animal welfare, since the thresholds of the ecological capacity has been exceeded. So even though pragmatic conservation welfare principles allow for a consequential approach and controlled harm to some individuals as expressed in the elephant management plan, the government policy was dictated by a no harm principle and the associated perceived of a culling program. And this resulted in a risk to biodiversity and severe suffering by a significant population of elephants and other animals. If a decision to cull were made 10 years ago, it would have only required the removal of a small number of animals every 2 years. The discrete removal of this small number in a relative low density population would have outweighed the negative emotional harm brought about by culling, until alternative population control mechanisms like PZP immunocontraceptives could have been implemented to ultimately replace or minimize the need for culling. Maintaining a good level of physical health through a less resource competition as a trade-off would have improved psychological and emotional health and overall well-being. The no harm and peaceful coexistence approaches as promoted by compassionate conservation principles supported the concerns by traditional conservationists by focusing on the short-term welfare of the charismatic elephant. The short-term welfare of the charismatic elephant resulted in the well-being of other animals being ignored. It allowed overpopulation of a native species with devastating consequences. It negatively affected governance and policy making. It undermined broader ethical considerations such as the greater good to the benefit of overall biodiversity conservation. So the Madikwe situation highlighted the need for taking appropriate proactive steps, even if the decision can be emotionally challenging. So that brings me to my little experiment that I referred to. So what follows now is a welfare assessment experiment based on conservation welfare concepts, where I use welfare as a parameter to assess the outcome of management-related veterinary interventions in free-ranging wildlife. So as I mentioned earlier, there are a few small subpopulations in close fence of privately owned reserves in southern Africa. And Limpopo Lepadi is one of those. It's a 20,000 hectare reserve in the east of Botswana. Small population of less than 45 elephants. The land use is tourism-based with an international shareholding. Traditional base carrying capacity determine the maximum stock rate of 50 elephants. So about 20 to 25 animals form part of the breeding herd, consisting of less than 10 adult females with calves in different ages and sexes. Even though the fence is very sturdy and electrified, break-ins by adult bulls from the adjacent wild Limpopo Valley population frequently occur. I did an aerial survey in 2019 at the reserve and then found that there were 25 adult bulls on the reserve, and they were causing a significant impact on the trees and other biodiversity in the reserve. So since culling was not considered an option, the management decided that we should translocate the 20 of these bulls to the Makgadikgadi Pans National Park, which is about 600 kilometers away by road. The Makgadikgadi Pans National Park has a population of about 2,000 elephants, mainly bulls, that consist of a small resident and a large nomadic population. It's an open system without fences. It's surrounded by subsistence agricultural land and hunting concessions, and several factors including distance from origin, truck access, cost, post-release monitoring, and access to resources and local experience were considered in the destination selection. So in August 2020, I captured and translocated 20 of these bulls of different ages and took them to Makgadikgadi Pan National Park. The total cost of the operation was more than 200,000 US. 5 of the bulls were fitted with GPS satellite collars, while the others were individually marked with notches on their tusk for identification. The elephants were captured and transported 2 at a time, and free released in the center of the park in an area with high elephant activity. The collar data provided us with insightful information on the movement of the elephants post-release. One elephant died 2 months later, presumably from thirst and heat stroke during the hot and dry November 2020, when he, with 5 other elephants, were looking for browse about 120 kilometers south of the release site. And that was about 80 kilometers away from the nearest water source. The other 2 collars were successfully removed 18 months later, both roughly 250 kilometers from where they were released, but to the opposite sides of the country. Most remarkably, what I called my problem child was another collared bull, number 4088, which eventually returned to Limpopo Lepari 14 months later. And that is as the crow flies 500 kilometers. And after wandering around for nearly 3,000 kilometers and several attempts to go down the escarpment towards Limpopo Lepari. And his route took him through densely populated areas, past villages, main roads. He was not alone. He brought 2 companions with him. In 2023, the bull population increased again to 15 bulls, and a decision was made to translocate another 10. So in March last year, I translocated 10 adult bulls to a destination in the northeast to the Zimbabwean border. It was really close to the Zimbabwean border. It was released adjacent to a hunting concession at a cost of about 150,000 US dollars. 2 bulls were collared with GPS satellite collars, but both collars failed shortly after. The other bulls were marked with notches on the tusks to prevent them from being hunted. The bulls moved into hunting concessions with fresh water supplies, where they were monitored by, ironically, the hunting outfitters, and staff until they dispersed following rain showers. So one bull was subsequently poached to the north near the Zimbabwean border, while another was killed, causing damage at a cattle post 230 kilometers to the south near Mashoro, and we eventually lost track of all the released elephants. So, the focus on welfare assessment challenges is this little experiment that I want to do. So the decision at Limpopo Lepari to reduce the elephant population was made in advance to reduce an already significant impact on biodiversity and the well-being of animals on the reserve. The translocations were deemed successful using objective management outcomes. However, how did success change when we assess the impacts of management-related veterinary procedures by using the welfare of the animals? The decision to translocate the bulls versus the option of culling was a compassionate-driven decision without the consideration of costs. The reserve has a strong US and European shareholder base, as I've said before, and they subsequently funded the translocation operations. But the question remains, was it the best decision based on welfare requirements? Let us consider the potential impact of culling first. The potential welfare impact on elephants remaining in the area after culling is perceived as severe, even though culling operations usually involve culling all the animals in the group. So from previous observations, we must assume that it can cause severe emotional stress and long-term distress to other surviving animals immediately present during the culling. Elephants are known to respond well to sustained landscapes of fears by avoiding it, whether it is created by hunting or poaching or landmines. In the absence of reliable on-site assessment methods, quantifying the more subtle impacts of culling on the welfare of individuals not in the immediate proximity remains a challenge. Applying behavioral and physiological changes based on observations and experience remain the only options. 1 or 2 bulls have been shot in the past, either on or adjacent to the reserve, with no obvious long-term distress shown by the remaining elephants. Therefore, since this case only involved bulls, anticipated impacts could have been mitigated and reduced by shooting single and isolated animals over time. But let's look at the process of capture and translocation impacts. There's sufficient scientific evidence that chemical immobilization causes stress to wildlife. Translocation causes physiological stress, most likely emotional stress. And we are constantly looking for new approaches to reduce this stress and to safeguard the welfare and safety of wildlife under our care. The use of sedatives and tranquilizer drugs during translocation is a balance between finding the right combination to allow restraint, reduce stress and anxiety, but allow normal functionality immediately post-release. And, just on the longer term, Despite our advanced physiological knowledge of capture and sedation combinations, research still indicates various degrees of physiological stress that can affect the welfare of these animals. And in the absence of easy and direct tests to assess a combination of physiological and emotional stress on site, we obviously prioritize mitigating the physiological stress that poses lethal dangers to the animals. Observing changes in the behavior uh, and measuring physiological parameters such as the peripheral blood pressure, basic blood gas changes, and even color, heart and breathing rates, etc., that remains the only practical means to us currently. Emotional stress is only addressed once it's visually obvious and it poses threats of physical injury to the animal or other animals or even to us. So physiological stresses were monitored during the capture and loading, uh, and we mitigate it as soon as we've seen it, when we thought animals were in danger. The methodology of translocation of elephants is complicated, and it's complicated by the size and the resultant need for heavy equipment. Swinging them upside down causes a big temporary increase in peripheral blood pressure in lower areas and likely cause pooling in some central blood compartments as well. And this was evident in the bulging ear veins. Some lung bleeding in one big bull and some milder cases, severe lung bleeding in one big bodied bull, and milder cases of lung bleeding in two other smaller bulls during last year's translocation, after hanging upside down, could have been attributed to the pooling or possibly physical lung trauma due to rolling them, because elephants lack a pleura, and the lungs are attached to the chest. Once detected, I treated, offloaded, and reversed the anesthetic in this bull with a severe lung bleeding, whilst treatment of the others with dexamethasone was sufficient to stabilize their conditions. Transportation stress and other species Studies on other species has confirmed that transportation induces some stress related, and that relates to dehydration, discomfort, fatigue, and probably a number of other things that we are not aware of. And it would be logic to assume that the same applied to the bulls. Transportation took between 8 to 12 hours, although the elephants spent longer time in the transport trucks waiting pre-departure. Despite the use of haloperidol or water-based propionazine, some bulls showed signs of anxiety and broke tusk trying to open the trailer doors during transport. Water was provided with a hose to all bulls that were willing to drink pre-departure, but one can assume a degree of dehydration. Post-release stress is another thing that we need to assess. We are not sure how the elephants respond post-release. They usually cope in a new environment by associating with other resident bulls to lead them to food and water. And these appear to be loose bonds that changes according to their need. One can assume that the initial period of adapting to the new environment can increase stress and affect overall well-being. Since they were released during the dry season, with long distances between browse and water, and extremely hot and dry conditions during October and November, adaptation was likely long and both physically and emotionally stressful. Some individuals would have coped better, but for others, as with the bull that died of heat stroke and dehydration, the process would have involved a high degree of suffering. Again, the limitations of no on-site assessments of more subtle forms and levels of emotional stress or suffering prevent us from confirming the impact on the surviving release bulls. However, the fact that one bull was determined to walk 3,000 kilometers in 14 months to return to the reserve is a significant indirect indicator of compromised well-being, which created the emotional need or yearning to return to the reserve, and that likely related to a sense of safety that he has experienced at the reserve. Although we know the conditions of the demise of 4 of the 30 bulls translocated, others could have been killed or died, as well or found themselves in the presence of others that died. We are not able to quantify emotional stress caused by being in the presence of other elephants being either poached, hunted, or died of natural causes, but logic dictates that that remains a possibility. And this is where I arrive to a very cynical side note at this stage. Since we have little insight into the real emotional impact of translocation on higher sentient animals such as elephants, the only efficient mitigation to prevent potential negative welfare impact and to safely navigate the unknown is to avoid translocations in total. But that creates a catch-22 situation when you consider the long-term welfare implications that we have seen in Madikwe. So our assessment will not be complete without assessing welfare impact on the remaining breeding herd. Uh, judging by their behavior, they appeared relatively unaffected after the surplus bulls were removed. The bulls randomly associated with the breeding herd before translocation for short periods, unless they were a cow in estrus, which resulted in the usual increased attention and the natural standoff between the bulls. The presence of the helicopter overhead and the increased activity during capture operations appeared to be a bigger disturbance. And the breeding herd would constantly move to the opposite side of the reserve. I'm pretty sure that fecal-based cortisol test would have indicated increase in cortisol during this time. The dripping temporal glands in some of the cows observed during the capture period may have been as a result of the stress caused by the capture operation. But because we didn't monitor it post-translocation to see if it improved, we cannot really, just make that deduction. So it's also not clear if these bulls, which we know can actually communicate over long distances, have managed to communicate the stress messages to the rest of the herd while they have been captured. So, as seen with the situation in Madikwe, the decision to reduce the population had significant potential to prevent profound negative impacts on the well-being of the population. So, there's definitely a need to reduce the population to keep it within the ecological capacity. But was translocation the best option from a welfare perspective? The lack of or the limitations of available evidence-based stress and welfare assessment methods makes it a difficult and subjective conclusion. Behavioral observation indicated the presence of stress at various levels and at various stages during and after the translocation process. But gaps in our knowledge prevent us from an objective overall well-being assessment. Since elephants are so charismatic, an unbiased comparison to compare physiological and emotional stress levels between culling and translocation without the usual anthropocentric based empathetic and vulnerable influences is very, very difficult. So additionally, we are also not sure about the intrinsic methods of coping mental stress by elephants, which can rectify these impacts. However, a systemic evaluation based on what we know and what we anticipate questions the validity of our decision in this situation. Stress related to a discrete culling operation with a fast removal of the carcass or carcasses would have likely caused less prolonged stress on the animals that remained behind. And that brings me to conclude my presentation. The conservation and promotion of welfare in free-ranging wildlife has come a long way to incorporate the concept of sentience and well-being of the individual animals within the context of biodiversity conservation. The concept of conservation welfare, promoting a systemic approach in decision-making based on evidence to determine the greater good to the welfare of the largest part of the population, provides a useful avenue to assess the impacts of our actions and decisions when working with free-roaming wildlife. Unfortunately, many other factors, such as socioeconomic, biodiversity, or financial factors, influence our decisions, and we certainly cannot make welfare-related decisions in isolation. The lack of simple, objective, effective on-site assessment methods to detect and quantify more subtle impacts of emotional stress further complicates the decision-making, and so does the potential influence of no-harm concepts driven by empathy and vulnerability. And these examples shows that although using consequential welfare assessments are important, considering it in isolation can result in decisions vastly different from what the reality dictates. And as a result, vets and wildlife managers are often in the crossfire when trying to merge conservation and wildlife welfare. Thank you very, very much for listening, and I am sharing some of the resources consulted. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Erik. Do we have any questions?
Hi there, Dr. Erik. I was wondering if there's any sort of additional data that you collect on these elephants after translocation besides the collar, like do you observe them to see if they are participating in any of their pleasurable behaviors like the mud baths or maybe collecting stool for cortisol measurements or anything like that? Or is it mostly just the collar and you let them do their thing?
All right. So let me first qualify my role. I am tasked for translocating these animals, and therefore I have a limited budget. Now, as a standard, I actually take a lot of samples, and I'm still sitting on it for two reasons. The one is we need a budget to be able to analyze those samples. And secondly, we have very, very little labs in Botswana. So getting permits for, CITES listed animals, even for lab purposes, are becoming increasingly difficult. So in short, the answer is, although I try and although I take samples, no, there's not a lot unless you register a research permit and unless you are able to get funding for it. And that is partially why I have started this non-profit, Wild South Africa, so that we can start doing some of these things outside the frameworks of the cost restrictions that has been imposed on us.
Gotcha. Thank you so much.
I have a question for you. Given the side effects you mentioned about hanging them upside down and the lung bleeding, what are the other ways that you can transport an elephant, and why do they hang them upside down?
That's a very, very interesting question. And I actually need to take a step back to answer that. For many, many years, we were not able to translocate adult elephants. And I don't know if you are following it, but you will remember that part of the culling operations in Kruger National Park, they would keep calves between the ages of around about 5 and 10 years, and those would go to zoos or those would be used to form new populations. But then we learned a very, very less sharp or severe lesson from that, in that the population that went to Pilanesberg, the bulls that were these orphans that were taken from from Kruger National Park during the culling, never had the social discipline that is required or that they get within their normal social interactions in the normal setup, in the natural setup. So in total, those bulls killed something like 30 white rhinos in Pilanesberg, and they damaged several cars and etc. etc. So then there was a severe drought in Zimbabwe, and two people, Ken and Vikas Kutsia, were desperate. They had a population of elephants and they had to shoot them because they were completely isolated and the drought was killing them. And then they decided they're going to take this chance. And they literally used the equipment where they could get, dart the animals, hang them upside down, swing them into a craters, and they got them out. And lo and behold, it worked. And for the first time, we know that we can actually hang these animals upside down, and that we can actually use that as a way to getting them out. So the equipment to load, especially big bulls, you have no choice than to swing them up, swing them down onto a low bed, then get them to the recovery crate, then pull them in, then let them get up, and then let them walk back. We have changed our approach to cows now and to calves and family groups that are lighter by using an open roof trailer, and where we can actually swing them through the top and put them down and wake them up. And we are actually now looking at harnesses that we are putting between the four legs so that we can bring them up upside down and don't necessarily have to swing them down, but swing them upside down. So this was something that was born really out of need, and we are looking at new or at different ways. Even rhinos now, we are swinging upside down, but they are much, in terms of weight, they are less and less problematic. The research with black rhinos has shown that it's not a major problem. White rhinos are heavier, so we need to look at that. I I am still trying. I know, I can physically see that the blood pressure in the ears go up. And because they just like horses, you have to be very, very careful. They hunt gut fermenters. So you have to be careful rolling them too fast, otherwise you can actually cause colic. exactly the same as with as with horses. And we try and roll them at the same line, the same way, keep them on the same side to prevent that torsion that you sometimes find in horses. But the fact that you are doing it slowly means that the blood pressure stays up for a little bit longer. And as I've mentioned, I'm not convinced that it was actually the lung bleed. I mean, the lung bleeding was caused by high blood pressure. It is possible. I have a strong suspicion that it's got to do with the fact that we are putting the animals on their side and we are rolling them. And if you think what that action means to the chest itself, so it actually changes the angle of the chest. And because they don't have a pleurum, the pleura and the lungs are connected to are basically attached to the side of the chest. It's quite likely that changing the shape causes direct trauma, and that is quite possible what has happened here as well. So we need to relook, and we are constantly relook our techniques to be able to mitigate these things that we are seeing, these physiological things that we are seeing. And I think it's a process that will keep on evolving and keep on evolving. But so far, we have managed to translocate a huge number of elephants, adult elephants. And to conclude the story of Pilansberg, once they've managed to introduce adult bulls, those adult bulls started disciplining these young bulls that has been causing all the damage, and all the problems have stopped. So there was a social aspect to it as well. I
Thank you very
hope it
much.
answers your question.
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Hello. We have one more question from Gabby. Do you want us to read it from the chat or do you want to ask it?
I can just ask it. It's probably easiest that way. Hi, how do you can hear me, right?
Yes, I can.
Okay, cool, awesome. How do you decide which elephants to translocate? And like, have you seen different levels of success depending on like if you transport a bunch that know each other versus a bunch of solitary bulls? And like, how does that affect it, I guess?
The social structure of the elephants are largely determining that. So when we translocate family herds, it is very, very important that you translocate the whole family herd because they are usually family for that matter. You know, you have a matriarch and you have all her calves with their calves with their calves that's forming these family herds. And they comprise of a breeding group. And we often see dynamics that during the rainy season they will split. And I mean, in the rainy season, yeah, in the dry season they will split, and that's most likely due to, you know, the pressure of food. And they will break up into their smaller family groups. And then when the rain comes in, suddenly you see these massive elephant herds. I'm not sure as if those social relationships are known, but certainly and what the impact is if you break those social relationships of the bigger herd. But certainly when you translocate smaller herds, you have to take the family, you know, the whole family. Uh, the bull situation is a little bit different. And one thing that we have learned in Makgadikgadi National Park through research by Elephants for Africa and some of those government organizations is that the bonds that form between the bulls are fairly loose. And therefore, it's really based on the immediate needs. And this is something that I have seen with Limpopo Leopardi as well. The bulls there would form groups. And then when you look for them 2 days later, then that group has changed. And then maybe for a week, three other bulls will go together, and then suddenly that changes. Then they go off again. And so there's a constant swap. What was interesting was 4088 had two companions. So when he left, he was all over the place, and I had to go and look for him several times during, post-release because he managed to get himself into strange places. And I had only the color data and Google Earth, and therefore I wasn't always sure what trouble he was in, or this is what trouble he was causing. So I would go and look for him, and always the same two companions. So he must have clubbed together with two nomadic elephants at his first meeting then, when we released him. And then he took control. And then he was the dominant bull, where he initially used them to find food and water. He started leading them. So he went south, then he went east, and they followed him. They were always with him. They went right into the escarpment, sometimes twice a month, three times a month. And I wasn't sure what was happening. And then during the dry season, they pulled back again. And then as soon as the rainy season started the next month, they took that bold step of crossing the escarpment, going past all those people. And voila, they turned up at the gate at the Poplar Park. So when we decide on these bulls, the selection of these bulls, that is fairly random. And it doesn't seem to make a big difference. But certainly when you talk about breeding groups, the family groups are very, very important. And the success rate, so far, fairly good.
Cool, thank you.
I think most of the problems that we encounter now, I don't know if you're aware of the situation that is in Zimbabwe and in Malawi, where they, and in Uganda, where they have released, I think it was African Parks, has released 200 elephants. And those elephants has got a massive impact now in the local communities. So the conflict is severe. And the strange thing is that they report now an increase on spotted hyena incidents, which we are still trying to figure out why that happens. But that impact is of the post-release is not only important on the welfare of the animals, but also, on the welfare of people and other wildlife around them. So that is a factor that you have to consider as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Erik. It was wonderful to hear from you. I hope you're doing
You're
all
welcome.
right.
Thank you very, very much. And thank you for the opportunity. And yes, enjoy the rest of the Congress.
Thank you. We really appreciate your time.
You're welcome. Bye.
Hello. Feel free to take a